So good morning. I hope everyone is well and finding ways to cope with these difficult and uncertain times. I know it's not easy, and I wish everyone the best. I would also like to thank FCW and others for pulling this together. It's been quite a journey. What you all don't know is when the question got asked about Commerce and NOAA, somehow I got bumped out. I was in the green room waiting, and so I had to very quickly join the conference. Anyway, I think there's been some great discussion. I'm going to talk a little bit more on the execution plan side of the house, and you'll see some commonalities with some things that you've already heard. So as you know, I'm Edward Horton. I'm currently a senior advisor at NOAA, but for the 7 years prior, I was the NOAA Chief Administrative Officer with records management as part of my portfolio. Many of you probably know Andre Civils. He's the NOAA Records Management Officer. He's out there in the audience, and so I'd just like to give a shout out to Andre for his role in keeping the NOAA enterprise on track throughout this process, because he's the individual that's really going to make this happen for the entity that's called NOAA, and I'll describe us here in just a minute in case you don't know who we are. You know, I'm pleased to be able to share our journey. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is taking this as kind of an opportunity to move our records management process from paper to the clouds, and also to become M1921 compliant. And that's not without a few challenges. Let me give you a little background on NOAA. NOAA is the largest bureau in the Department of Commerce, consists of about 21,000 employees and contractors. We're performing science, research, and stewardship missions, as well as early warning for protection of lives and property, more on the weather forecasting side. $6 billion operating budget, and nearly 800 occupied facilities across the United States and the Pacific Islands. NOAA consists primarily of 6 operating units, and then the mission support staffs and services like IT, HR, acquisition, grants, and administrative services. As many of you know, science and researchers love their paper. Their offices are full of files, they're full of studies, they're full of a lot of interesting things that frequently go back many years, but technically are official records. They also love their data. Frequently, they print their data out, so we also have that challenge. Now, NOAA was originally scheduled to participate in a shared service automated records management process coordinated by and across the Department of Commerce. It became very complicated quickly, and it's clear that the department's shared services initiatives and efforts in the record management area really is stalled at this point, and it may not produce results for several years. And as the speakers just mentioned a few minutes ago, you know, bureaus are going to have to kind of figure this out on their own, and that's what NOAA is doing. So in my case, after receiving the 2018 NARA guidance and then the OMB memo last fall, I knew NOAA had to get moving. In particular, we needed to come up with a pilot that would help us chart the way. So I started looking at M1921, the requirements, and then keeping in mind that we do have a date, 12/31/22 is kind of a date that we're all going to work from. And so I started doing some backwards planning. And I developed a few steps that are needed to meet the M1921 requirements, and they form the basis of my plan that I'm going to discuss with you here over the next several minutes. So I chose NOAA Acquisition and Grants Office to do a pilot. I selected the contracting office because they're located in 5 sites around the country primarily. That's Maryland, Virginia, Kansas, Colorado, and Washington. They have a large amount of paper files stored on site, and they're in a variety of owned and leased space. Now, NOAA contract files are typically eligible for destruction 7 years after the last activity of the contract, with a few exceptions. NOAA does not have an automated contract writing system at this point. We've been engaged in trying to get there for several years, and we think we're probably 3 to 5 years away from a system. So we have lots of paper contract files. We're going to have to do something with those files. They are stored in our space, and we're paying top dollar to manage those files in that manner. So the steps that I've started to get us there for this pilot Starting back in August, I conducted a series of educational sessions at the director level to be sure that there was awareness of the changes coming to records management, the records management process. But just as importantly, to get across the point that they have a role in managing these records into the future. And I also started these education sessions focusing on the basics because my assumption was, and it seemed to be pretty correct, that our directors really weren't aware of the requirements that are placed upon them and things that are going to be coming down the road. So I started with defining very quickly permanent and defect and temporary records, and then I used NOAA examples to make this very important. And I used some standard meetings that NOAA leadership has in terms of making sure that I had a little bit of opportunity to participate. And I'd take 10 or 15 minutes every couple of months over the last 6 or 8 months to kind of make sure that people knew what was happening. For the acquisition and grant side of the house, I took a look at the variety of contracts that we have in the system, and I very quickly created 4 categories. I then presented the 4 categories back to the directors to see if I'd missed anything. The feedback that I got was no, they thought they were about right. And so let me run through those 4 categories with you just to give you a context of where we're going. So I looked across our locations. We have contracts that are awaiting closure. They're no longer active. They need to be closed, then stored or destroyed. These contracts in our agency, because we're primarily science and research, and we have a daily mission of contracting for more services and activities, that closing contracts kind of takes a back seat frequently. So we have a variety of these. I know one location has 2,500 that he needs to close before we can figure out whether they get destroyed or digitized. Then we have closed contracts that are ready for destruction. We have a number of those. Those have been closed 6 or more years, as I said a short time ago. We need to destroy them, but at the same time, we want to know the contract number and we want to know when it was destroyed, because from our perspective, we could get a FOIA, Freedom of Information request, or we might get an audit, or we might have somebody ask a question. One of the vendors may ask a question about that contract. So we just want to know the status, and we'll need a system to help us do that. Then we have closed construction contracts that are awaiting destruction. They're closed and they haven't reached the destruction date, and so they got to be stored until such time as we destroy them, or they need to be digitized and moved somewhere. And then we have open active contracts like everybody, and they're recently awarded or they're ongoing contracts, and they'll have a disposition in many cases after 2022. So we have to look at them very carefully as to what we want to do with that population of contracts. So these 4 contracts, or these 4 categories of contracts, are the focus of our work over the next 18 months to 2 years, along with taking the appropriate steps for managing our permanent files. So I'm going to give you a list of things that we think need to be done, but it's not just a list. It's really some thoughts and some ideas that came to me as to how you go about getting this done. Keep in mind that this is really a large change management initiative. So you need continual communication with the workforce, also with the leaders and managers. And the way in which we're going to do that in this pilot is we will be focusing on presenting updates from the directors on their progress, as well as providing information to the workforce at large during our quarterly town halls. We also are in the process of developing a guidance memo for the entire organization, explaining the purpose, the process, along with key dates and milestones, and we will highlight responsibilities to the extent that we can. We also created a very small team of 4 personnel that are going to start working on determining the volume and the amount of files by category, the category being those 4 that I highlighted earlier, at each of the 5 locations. Essentially, they're going to need to go on site, triage the files to develop an accurate baseline. If we don't know the baseline, we really don't know what we're working against. We also need to develop a plan to record and destroy a percentage of contracts that are eligible for destruction. And in the case of my plan, I'm pushing to do that quarterly with quarterly reporting. And there may be some resources available to assist, but in my mind, if we aren't having feedback on progress, this probably isn't going to get accomplished. It'll be one of those things that'll go off to the side. So we've also put a little bit of money aside if we need to hire somebody on the third-party side to help us with this, particularly on the destruction side of the house, once we know what it is we want to destroy. We've also created a team that's going to help close contracts, and they will be on a timeline, and they'll be reporting on their quarterly progress also. We need a decision very shortly from the office director, the senior official for contracts, on how long NOAA will manage paper contracts on site awaiting destruction after 2022. We may digitize those and put them on a SharePoint site. That might be the approach we take. We really haven't decided exactly how we want to do that, but we do know we're going to have paper contracts into the future. That's just the way it works in the contract business. We'll also have some contracts that will have destruction 2025, 27. So we need to look at that and see how we want to approach that. We're also going to acquire digitization hardware and then the training piece that goes along with that, as well as the training that goes along with the records management, moving our process from paper to automation to electronic and into the future. We also have to develop a digitization strategy and standards. And we'll look to NARA, which is almost ready, unless I missed something this morning. They haven't quite told us, but we think we're pretty close to what they're going to require in terms of DPIs and the kinds of equipment, and we'll get that off of Schedule 36. And at the same time, we may want to go with a third party that will do that. We're not totally sure yet, because we know that once we get an automated contract writing system, we will have the process to move these electronically and anywhere we need to do that. So we also have to develop some internal procedures on how we're going to send our permanent records to NARA and what the deadline is going to be and who's going to do that. And we haven't quite got there yet. And then we all want to be prepared to send those files to NARA in the appropriate format by 2022, December. So as we buy digitization equipment or learn skills for the workers that will be the workforce that's going to be dealing with digitization, we also need to make sure that our systems match with NARA. And so we see during that last quarter or the last half of 2020 of calendar year 2022, we want to be making sure that we can pass our files appropriately to NARA, and we're not thinking that we have a solution and we find out it's not a solution that will work. So we'll be working with NARA very closely at that point to make sure we can pass data. We don't want to be having to move things that we don't need to move, and we also want to make sure that we have taken care of all those things that we can destroy. So this is the approach that we've come up with. We think it will get us to compliance, and at that point, I'm really ready to take your questions. I didn't have slides because I really wanted this to be more of a fireside chat. And so I hope that this has stimulated some thoughts and some questions out there in the audience. Thank you very much for your time.
And thank you very much. We do have a couple questions. 1 second here. One's very specifically about the work you've been doing, and how did you decide to focus so much on contracts when it comes to responding to TAM 1921?
We did that because the director was very interested in a solution. He knew that the Commerce Standard was paper. He knew that he had a lot of paper, and he wanted to be able to get into compliance by 2022. The other thing that was a kind of a driver is we're doing on the facility side some consolidation and some relocations within our headquarters there in Silver Spring. And so we know that we're storing files on site at the cost of administrative space, and we wanted to be able to reduce some of our cost a little bit so that we could put that money into other activities. And so as a result of all that and some discussions with me handing him some of these memos and saying, this really is a problem. We need to figure out how we can do this. And we're not sure that the department is going to get engaged in time to get this done. So let's do a pilot. Let's see what we can do. Let's move out there on our own, and we'll make sure that anything we do will be compatible with anything that the larger NOAA enterprise wants to do, or that the Department of Commerce gets into several years down the road. Again, this is for the Acquisition and Grants Office, primarily looking at the contract management, because our grant system is already online. We're looking at contract management and solving an interim problem, if you will, for the contracting activity, and that is the fact that they've got huge volumes of paper that sits in some storage. And so we're looking at ways to make that, to do that smarter, better, and hopefully a little cheaper.
Very good. And then a devil's advocate question. You mentioned a lot of this is on paper, but one of the upsides of paper is that the file format doesn't change over time. And so this question was, how are we, or are we, question mark, to plan for changing in legacy file formats in all of these digital records that are going to be stored? How are we going to keep from having the petabytes of data at NARA in legacy file formats that no one can access?
So I think that that's a solution for the technical folks, because I don't even know what legacy format is. But from my perspective, we will get it there with what's required at the time in the format and in the DPIs that can be read, and it'll be in a digitized form that will be available for the future. And I assume that as time goes on, there'll be the NARA will then have responsibility for migrating that data. It's not something an agency is going to have to do once it gets into NARA.